Hello and welcome to this lecture on dietary fats. Now today we're talking about dietary fats in the context of heart disease, and the thinking about dietary fats has really shifted dramatically in the last decade, so there might be some new information in this lecture for you. We're going to look first at saturated fats, briefly talk about trans fats, and then focus on unsaturated fats, so recommendations that we can make for our patients and our clients in order to help them make the right fat choices. So just for a little bit of history, historically, starting in about the 1980s, the late 80s, early 90s, the American Heart Association and the U.S. government nutrition authorities were really on a low-fat focus. Okay, they had firm belief that it was a low-fat diet that was going to be the panacea for heart disease. And you all know what happened, right? We cut out all the fat, replaced it with all these high-sugar, fat-free cakes and cookies and pies, etc. And guess what? America got fatter and rates of heart disease continued to increase. Okay, a whole bunch of research since that time has evolved, and we're beginning to look more critically at fat. And now the approach to fat is, and should be for our patients, listen, it's not the amount of fat in your diet that appears to matter. It's really the type of fat that matters. So we don't want to encourage low-fat diets anymore because low-fat diets are synonymous with high-sugar diets for the most part. You take the fat out, you replace it with the sugar. That does a disservice to your body as well. So instead, we want to encourage fat because of all the wonderful things that fat does for our bodies. However, we need to focus on the right types of fats, and that's the point of this lecture. So let's start first about the location of body fat. Okay, we're looking here at a study from the journal Hypertension published in 2001. It's called the Health, Aging, and Body Composition Study. And it looked at over 2,500 individuals who were aged 70 to 79. And it found that those with more abdominal visceral fat had stiffer arteries than those with less. Okay, so it didn't matter whether they were normal weight, overweight, or obese. But we really do need to be monitoring for the location of body fat. Okay, most of this lecture we're going to talk about dietary fat, but the fat and where it's located in your body actually does matter, and that abdominal or central obesity, the one we see in those apple-shaped people, we really now know that that's actually a much more dangerous type of fat than the subcutaneous fat that you find in other parts of the body, like the hips, the thighs, and the butt. Okay, the abdominal fat leaches into the bloodstream more readily and is metabolized in such a way that it actually has a negative effect on our blood lipid profile. As far as saturated fatty acids go, okay, a fatty acid is saturated when all possible places where hydrogens can live on the carbon-carbon backbone of that fatty acid are present. So there's no double bonds, okay? And so saturated fatty acids are nice and straight and they stack very well and tight together, which is why saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature. So you can remember that by thinking S for saturated and S for solid. And we find saturated fatty acids primarily in animal foods. The biggest sources of saturated fat in the U.S. diet are things like meat, cheese, full-fat dairy, ice cream, and butter. Okay? It is important to note that the types of fats that we find in a lot of processed foods like palm kernel, and coconut oil, even though those are plant-based sources of fat, they're predominantly saturated fats. Okay? And there's a little bit of discrepancy in the research about are the saturated fats that we find in plant foods like palm kernel, and coconut oil, are they as dangerous? And do they have the degree of the negative effect on our LDL cholesterol levels as the animal fats with LDL do? Okay, and so there is a little bit of discrepancy there, but at the end of the day, you need to tell your patient that there's no beneficial reasons to add more of those saturated fats. And that's where a lot of people get concerned, or confused rather. They think, okay, if coconut oil is maybe not as bad for me as lard and butter is, that must mean it's good for me. And that is certainly not the case. There's no benefit to adding a very concentrated source of saturated fat to your diet. Most people don't have the calorie budget for it, and it still appears that there is a deleterious effect on LDL cholesterol levels, even if you get your saturated fats from plant versus animal sources. At the end of the day, American Heart Association on down, everyone is still recommending we want to reduce the proportion of fat in our diet that is saturated fat, regardless of whether it's plant or animal origin. Top food sources of saturated fat in the United States, and this is from the National Cancer Institute, not surprising, regular cheese, pizza. Okay, think about pizza. It's packed with meat that's high in saturated fat and cheese that's high in saturated fat. Okay, grain-based desserts are made with butter and other types of unhealthy fats. Dairy desserts, full-fat dairy is packed with saturated fat. Meat, okay? If you're looking for suggestions to help people who are really motivated to lower their dietary their LDL cholesterol levels in their blood, that is, cut out meat or cut back on meat. Okay. When you're talking about portion sizes, it helps to know that raw meat reduces by about 25% when cooked. So if you're looking at a 4-ounce serving of raw meat, that's going to cook down to a 3-ounce serving of cooked meat. Now there's different definitions about meat. Okay. Lean, the USDA says that can have no more than 10% fat. And lean sounds good, but if you actually look at the label, okay, and a lot of meat products don't have labels on them, so you can go to the USDA ground beef calculator. That's a great tool online that shows you just how much saturated fat is really still in a lean product. Where we want our patients to be at is with extra lean. Okay, extra lean is no more than 5% fat. Prime beef is going to be the fattiest, select is the leanest, and choice is going to be in the middle. Poultry is also a significant source of saturated fat in the diet, and that's because most Americans think, oh, I'm doing myself such a great favor by switching to chicken and not eating steak. If you are eating the dark meat of chicken, meaning the legs, the wings, and the thighs, ounce for ounce, you are probably getting as much saturated fat as if you eat a steak. So if you like the dark meat of chicken, then fine, eat it. But don't eat that and fool yourself into thinking that you're doing something good for your body. Because the reality is there's still too much saturated fat in the dark meat of chicken. Okay? Thighs have more fat than wings, wings have more fat than drumsticks, and drumsticks have more fat than breast. Okay, chicken breast, as you probably know, is low in fat, so of course it's low in saturated fat. You also want to look out for ground turkey. A lot of people will go to a restaurant and buy a turkey burger and think, that they're a wonderful, healthy individual. And a lot of times the turkey burger, if you actually look at the nutrition facts, will have more fat, calories, and saturated fat per serving than a burger does, because the ground turkey or the ground chicken, oftentimes they're grinding up the skin as well as the dark meat. Okay, so if you're at home and you buy extra lean ground turkey, okay, and you can read the label, you know that that's going to be a healthier option than if you go to a restaurant and order a turkey burger where, let's be honest, they're not making that out of extra lean ground beef. Now, when you remove saturated fat, okay, it may have the unintended consequence of increasing triglycerides, because historically what people do is when they cut out fat, they add in carbs and sugar. Okay, so if you replace your saturated fat with refined carbohydrates, your triglycerides will go up. The key to mitigating that is to replace those saturated fat calories not with refined white high sugar carbohydrates, but rather with high fiber, whole grain, fruits, vegetables, and lentils in order to prevent elevated triglycerides. Okay, and the key there is fiber. So when you cut out the saturated fat, add back the carbs that have fiber in them in order to prevent that elevation of blood triglyceride levels that we sometimes see when people cut out the sat fat. How much saturated fat should we have? Okay, we're holding fast with recommendations for anywhere from 7 to 10% of the total calories. Okay, keeping in mind that 1 gram of saturated fat, as with all fat, has 9 calories. For someone on a 2,000 calorie diet, that works out for something between 16 to 22 grams a day. Okay, on the food labels, the daily value, even with the new food label and the newly revised daily value, saturated fat stays the same. It's 20 grams a day. Okay, and as I mentioned, whole milk and higher fat milk products can actually be a significant source of saturated fat. Okay, whole milk is great for kids aged 1 to 2 who still need that fat for brain development, little old ladies who can't keep weight on, and maybe high school boys who are having trouble keeping weight on. The rest of us do not need whole milk. Okay, take a look at the comparison for the nutrition facts panel of the whole milk label on the left and the non-fat one on the right. Okay, you've got almost twice as many calories in a cup of whole milk as you do in a cup of skim or fat-free milk. Okay, and the reason why whole milk we don't need it is because more than 50% of the fat in whole milk is from saturated fat. If you only get 20 grams a day for your daily value, and you drink a cup of whole milk, you can see there that there's 5 grams of saturated fat. Okay, that's 25% of your daily value. Let's say you actually follow the government guidelines of drinking 3 cups of milk a day, but you drank 3 cups of whole milk, that would be 15 grams of saturated fat. And I guarantee you, someone drinking whole milk definitely has other animal products in their day, and they don't have room in their saturated fat budget to be getting 75% of their saturated fat grams from whole milk. Okay. The other side of the coin is we drink milk, if you can tolerate it and you're not allergic to it, because of the beneficial things that it provides, like protein, calcium, vitamin D, and vitamin A. And if you compare whole versus non-fat milk, there's the same amount of protein, calcium, vitamin D, and even slightly more vitamin A in the non-fat than the whole milk. Okay, so most people could do just fine on fat-free milk, you cut out the bad stuff, namely the saturated fat, but you preserve just as much of the good stuff, which is why we want to be drinking milk in the first place. A little bit about trans fat. As I mentioned earlier, it's really not a public health concern. In 2006, the U.S. government, the FDA, said that they were going to be putting the trans fat information on the food label. Okay, trans fats raise our LDL cholesterol levels. Okay, so a number of groups in Washington, D.C., namely the Center for Science and the Public Interest, they really pressured the FDA to add trans fat to the label. They did. Manufacturers reacted to Americans freaking out by pretty much swapping out trans fat and replacing it with saturated fat. So sometimes your clients will ask you, hey, what's worse for me, butter or margarine? Again, that's a totally loaded question because they're both not good for you. Butter is packed with saturated fat that raises LDL, and margarine is packed with trans fat that raises LDL. Okay, so pick whichever one you like or prefer the taste of or can afford, but know that both butter and margarine should be used in moderation because both saturated fats and trans fatty acids elevate LDL cholesterol levels. Now, manufacturers love trans fats because it stabilizes the fat and prevents it from going rancid. Okay, so the trans fatty acid arrangement that you see there in the middle of the slide, that trans fatty acid, that one's going to be more shelf stable. It also provides this really pleasurable mouthfeel that we as humans gravitate towards and love. Okay, kind of think about the reason why a Twinkie can stay on the shelf at 7-Eleven for 5 years. It's because there's some trans fat in there. Okay, otherwise most foods with fat will go rancid, but trans fats have longer shelf lives. Lastly, I just want to mention monounsaturated fats, which are our good or our healthy fats. Okay, if our focus is not on reducing fats, but rather focusing on eating good fats, you need to know which foods have those good fats. And you're probably already aware, but monounsaturated fats are what we call the heart healthiest fats. And they're found in foods like avocado, canola oil, peanut and sesame oils, olives, peanut butter, sesame seeds, and nuts. And momentarily in a subsequent lecture, we're going to look a little bit more closely at the Mediterranean diet, and we'll focus some more on these good heart healthy fats.